Hello G2 and welcome to this toolbox on prophetic prayer. Now, prophetic prayer is a bold choice to have chosen this one because I think a lot of people find this idea or this practice as maybe a little bit intimidating, possibly a little bit scary. And I can understand that because I think sometimes it feels like maybe prophetic prayer, and we'll unpack a little bit what that is only for a special kind of Christian. Maybe the sort that always go to retreats or conferences and that have some kind of special pipeline to the voice of the Lord that ordinary people don't have. And my hope with this session as we go through is to demystify that a little bit and bring prophetic prayer maybe a little bit more into our ordinary practice of what it means to follow Jesus, and also embed it a little bit more in our understanding of the Bible. Where does it come from? What are its roots? And how might we begin developing prophetic prayer as part of our normal walk with the Lord? Okay, so let's start with what prayer is, because if we're going to do any prophetic prayer, you probably need to start with prayer. And I think, so I've been thinking about this, that prayer is a little bit like a two-step. You know, like the most basic move in dancing is the two-step, isn't it? It's just like one step, two-step, you've started dancing. There's loads of different complicated ways of dancing, lots of different routines. You can do if you watch Strictly, you can do an Argentine tango or a rumba or a cha-cha-cha, but it all starts really with some basic foot movement, doesn't it? And I think that's what it's like with prayer and prophetic prayer. It starts with a two-step. The one step of prayer is into the presence of God. You step into the presence of God by opening up the conversation with Him. That's what we're talking about in prayer, is talking to the Father. So if you're figuring out for the first time, maybe you're just exploring faith or you're really quite new to it, start with the Lord's Prayer. That's how Jesus teaches us to pray. And He starts with our Father. Our Father. He says we are all part of the same family with the same God, and we can speak to Him. That's prayer. You begin talking to Him about what's going on in your life, what you're struggling with, what you're worried about. All the things of normal conversation you can bring to God in prayer and develop relationship. That's the first step. Then the second step is, as you develop that relationship, as you grow in that conversation, God starts to invite you into things, invite you into what He is doing in the world. Because prayer doesn't stop with an intimate conversation, even though that's like the foundation. The next step is outward. So you take the one step inward to relationship with God, and the second step outward to His redemption of the world. So prophetic prayer is like the second step of the two-step. You step into relationship with God, and you step out to speak His truth and join in with what He's doing in the world. So, what's your experience of prayer? I think stop now, maybe have a conversation in your group over how you find prayer, and is it something that comes easy to you? Is it something you find quite difficult? Is it something that you've had seasons of real richness and growth in, and seasons where it all feels a bit like God on mute, like that famous book where God is quiet? What's your experience of prayer? So, let's begin to look at, once we've done the one step of what we're doing in prayer, then we can step into prophetic prayer. What do we mean when we're talking about the prophetic? Because again, I think that word itself is possibly quite an intimidating, maybe slightly mystical one. I think the word prophetic is basically speaking as though divinely inspired. That's what it's saying. It's the word, it's speaking through having been in the presence of God and your words being shaped by that. But it's also, if we look across the Bible and we look at where prophecy comes up, it's more than just being divinely inspired. It's voicing what God is doing in the world. It's enacting something new. That's what prophetic prayer is. Through our relationship with him, we begin to see his vision for the world, and we begin to speak that into being. In Romans 8, it says, creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. God is waiting for us as his children to join in his big plans and big vision. And he doesn't just do it as like you're coming and you're putting out the bricks. He's like, no, I want you to shape it with your voice, to speak into it. Like they spoke in Eden and named all the animals, God's like, I want you to come in, I want you to name things, point things out, challenge things, provoke things. And that's like the start of prophecy, is identifying in the world what God is doing. Now, we often think of prophetic prayer as being quite individual. You get the thing of like, oh, someone's praying for someone, and you know, when you start to pray for someone, you might talk about what's going on in their life, and you might be praying over a particular thing that we want to see change, that we want to see God change something. Prophetic prayer is an activation of the imagination in that, because as you're praying for someone, God might be shaping your words, might be speaking to you, and the way he might do that is through your imagination for that person. And that's a part of encouraging them. In prayer, how do we encourage people? But it doesn't just stop at the individual. That's an important place to begin, but it doesn't stop there. It's also about what we see around us. A classic example of prophetic prayer is from the prophet Amos. Now, the prophet Amos, I think, was one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s favourite people in the Bible, and he quotes him a lot. And I often think of like, there's a bit of a connection point there. Martin Luther King Jr. refers to Amos because he has a bit of that Amos spirit about him, when in the 60s and in the civil rights movement, he is calling into being, calling out things. He is prophesying what he sees as God's vision for the world, which is challenging the injustice around him. He quotes in his letter from Birmingham jail one of the most well-known verses in Amos, which I am going to find. And I have lost it. Talk amongst yourselves whilst I find this verse. And I can't. Oh, here we go. It's in chapter 5, verse 24. Chapter 5, verse 24, it says, "Let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream." Martin Luther King in Birmingham jail speaks about this because he's saying, this is God's vision for the world. He's speaking out. He sees injustice and he's saying, this is what Amos saw as well in his time. Now, the book of Amos, I can't explain it all in the few minutes we have here, but it begins by a prophetic, provocative challenge to the nation he sees around him. And he says things like, I raised up prophets from your children, this is in the voice of the Lord, I raised up prophets from your children and Nazarites from among your youths. Is this not true, people of Israel, declares the Lord? But you made the Nazarites drink wine and commanded the prophets not to prophesy. It starts in Amos with him talking about how the prophets have been silenced, how people have been stopped from challenging and provoking what they see around them. And as he prophesies, he says, he goes on to say, this is what I see in the nation of Israel. This is what it should be, and this is what it is. He challenges, he says, you levy a straw tax on the poor and impose a tax on the grain. You've built mansions of stone, but you don't live in them. I know how many are your offences and how great your sins. There are those who, this is in chapter 5, there are those who oppress the innocent and take bribes and deprive the poor of justice in the courts. Therefore the prudent keep quiet in such times, for the times are evil. Prophecy and prophetic prayer is, in Amos's sense, about challenging the injustice he sees around him. But it doesn't go well, because the prophecy gets challenged by the people and by the king in the final chapters. In the final chapters, it says, Amos is raising a conspiracy against you in the very heart of Israel. The land cannot bear his words. He said, Amaziah, who is a priest, says to Amos, get out, you seer, go back to the land of Judah, earn your bread there and do not prophesy here, and do your prophesying there. Don't prophesy any more at Bethel, because this is the king's sanctuary and the temple of the kingdom. And Amos answers Amaziah, and this comes back to me for the ordinariness of prophecy. He says, I was neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but I was a shepherd, and I also took care of sycamore fig trees. But the Lord took me from the tending the flock and said to me, Go prophesy to my people Israel. Now then, hear the word of the Lord. Prophecy, like in Amos, is about starting that relationship with God, hearing him, listening to him, speaking that out. Begin first with one another and then challenging the injustice that he sees around him. And he says that he's not a particularly special person. He just says he was a shepherd, but the Lord has spoken to him, has shown him his vision for the world. And that's what we do in prophetic prayer. We call out, we enact, with our voices and through communion and a relationship with God and hearing him, we use our voices to bring change, to provoke, to inspire, and to give a new hope for the future. The very end of Amos, I'll just read because I think it lands with that encouragement and that hope that I think we see in prophecy, because it's not all challenge. It says, it's the Lord speaking. It says, In that day I will restore David's fallen shelters. I'll repair its broken walls and restore its ruins, and will rebuild it as it used to be. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when the reaper will be overtaken by the ploughman and the planter by the one treading grapes. New wine will drip from the mountains and flow from all the hills, and I will bring my people Israel back from exile. They will rebuild the ruined cities and live in them. They will plant vineyards and drink their wine. They will make gardens and eat their fruit. I will plant Israel in their own land, never again to be uprooted from the land I have given them, says the Lord your God. He is saying that prophecy is about speaking out new life, new gardens, and a new hope. So in your groups, we're going to begin to try it. So the way we do that is just start simply by praying for the things that are already on your heart. Share in your groups first what is on your heart in the world around you that you'd like to see changing, because God, I think, is already speaking to you through your conscience, through your experiences. And then, once you've shared those, pray about them. What might God be saying to you about the world around you? What might God be saying to the individuals in the group? Have a go at it. We discern, we get things wrong, that's okay, we learn together. Pray and prophesy for the next bit of time in the rest of your group, and see how the Lord is bringing new hope to you and to others.